On tonight's episode of the Talkin TV podcast, we meet up to discuss the latest film from the Russo brothers, Anthony and Joe Russo, also their production company, Agbo Films, as well as the latest and first major film that we've watched from Apple TV Plus. That'd be Cherry, starring Tom Holland as a drifter turned Marine soldier turned dropout opioid addict. We will be covering all of that and more on tonight's show. I'm Dom, the movie nerd.
I'm Chris, the TV nerd. Get ready, guys. I'm sure we have a lot to say about this one. That is already a guarantee. So without further ado, let's get into it, right, Dom?
Let's do this. What is up, people? Happy to have you guys back on a regularly scheduled podcast night on a regular Monday for us regular average going movie and TV nerds here. We've actually got another movie to talk about. Again, I feel like it's been a little bit since our last movie, but then again, wait, what am I kidding? We watched Raya and the Last Dragon last week. I don't know what I'm talking about. Just last week was a
yeah, we had two last week.
Yeah, we had two last week to talk about. Yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about. Like
double feature.
That shows.
But I know what you mean, because 2020 we did like what, 7 movies total, and we're up to 7 already this year, just about.
Something like that. Yeah, something like that. We've already watched more movies than the first 3 months of this year than last year. Now, whether they're better this year than last year, that's a different story. But
yeah, we'll get into it all.
I'm very, very happy to have movies back is all that I can say. Because, again, that's what we primarily started this as. I know you're the TV guy. I brought TV into this channel in a very big way. But my goal was always to review movies. And so I'm glad that at the very least we're doing that. But before we get started tonight, of course, as always, we've got some people already showing up in the chat.
What's going on, guys? Welcome in. Stranger Boy, of course. He's going to watch this movie tonight. All right. Hey, just so you know, I mean, you guys know we're going to spoil it already. Yes. We'll give you a little warning, I suppose. We hope you stick around, but I get it if you got to leave this one time, Stranger Boy, where we understand. Yes. Spoilers aren't fun for anyone. That rhymed, and it should be a thing the industry adopts. I think so. And Luke is...
I don't know where that came from. Like, I just want to...
I don't know.
Like, what is that? What?
It was very Mother Goosey, huh?
Was that like a reference to like that one weird joke in Far From Home when like the one Russian chick made him strip down for no reason? Like,
oh no, I forgot about that. Yeah, no.
One of many reasons why I hate that movie. But
hey, Dom, before we get into this, I kind of want to. I don't know. I think it'd be fun to answer Stranger Boy's comment as if we like put yourself back into the shoes of someone who hasn't seen this yet.
Okay.
Were you looking forward to this film? Because he is.
Yeah, I was. I absolutely was. For a lot of different reasons. Look, I'll say that obviously the Russo brothers, taking aside the whole Marvelification of it, you know, which is kind of difficult to do considering that I would say that of all the directors that Marvel has attracted, they've had probably the biggest impact and effect both on the MCU as well as what the MCU has kind of done for them. Again, and just, I don't know, like, I really enjoyed the Russo brothers because they've always, to me, struck me as, like, kind of like the working class directors that kind of, I don't know, like, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. I know that's kind of like a coy term that's kind of been, like, lost, I feel like, in today's just modernist struggle. But, like, there's always kind of been, like, that working class level to them. You know, obviously they got their start early on in their careers because they attracted some attention early on with one of their early festival movies from Steven Soderbergh and George Clooney, who actually helped to get their first film, that being Welcome to Collinwood, made. And then they had a little bit of a weird career throughout the rest of the late 90s and early 2000s. They ended up making this really kind of generic early 2000s comedy, like in that wave of comedy starring Owen Wilson and Matt Dillon, called You, Me, and Dupree.
Yeah, I know about that one.
Yeah, but that was kind of like before their reign on TV started, because the thing about the Russo brothers is that they effectively kind of revolutionized TV by bringing the single camera sitcom to to network television with Arrested Development. Like the whole spin that they had on Arrested Development was originally going to be a traditional like multi-camera sitcom, and they came up with the idea, why don't we just shoot it like single camera documentary style? And
so correct me if I'm wrong. What was their involvement in Arrested Development? I don't think I've ever quite known.
Very, very similar to Community. They directed almost every single episode in the first season of that show, including the pilot episode, and then they came back to direct a couple of episodes in seasons 2 and 3, and it was shortly after Arrested Development was canceled the first time that they ended up getting the Community script, and from there, it was onward. You know, their career was set. And it's still insane to me. I know I've talked to this, but the thing is that I feel like a lot of people know about the Russo brothers' career community, you know, going forward, just considering how publicized it's been because of their whole involvement with Marvel and everything. But pre-community is kind of like always like a weird area for them. But again, like just the definition of you never know where your career could take you in Hollywood. You know, you go literally from directing a early 2000s comedy to directing the highest grossing movie in the world in the course of 17 years. So that
yeah,
like,
and you know what's crazy about that?
About Hollywood, that I don't know what does.
I've never really spoken about Arrested Development. I did have a huge phase where I really liked that show. It hasn't been one that I've gone back to, but I mean, if I had to make a list of like important sitcoms, to me, it'd be on that list. And that's funny because I didn't even realize they had such a big involvement with that film. You know, like it's the Russo brothers are people who I respect a lot. Like a lot, because they were some of the first creators to come from TV, not on the actor side of things, but along with those first few actors who transitioned successfully into film. And back then it was kind of like you did one or the other. And they were sort of still a part of that old way of thinking where, you know, look, if these guys weren't as good as what they do, they might have been right back down to what they used to consider the minor leagues in film, you know, I mean, TV rather, from film to TV.
And so for them about that, real quick, sorry to cut you off, but what's so funny about that is they're arguably part of what started the transition from film to TV, because their whole approach to
or TV to film, right?
From TV to film, because
we keep saying that.
Trust me, they're interchangeable at this point. But what was funny about their involvement in Arrested Development was the fact that why they were able to have a unique lens that ended up getting them the job was their idea to effectively shoot it like a low-budget movie.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of part of the magic of that, you know?
It does have, now that you say that, it has that. That, you know, I mean, I think the sense of humor is a little more modern than I think the time that it was written in was ready for. So I think that's kind of like Arrested Development's a show that ages really well, but not just because of the writing. You know, I think it's got that feel that it could have come out now, and it probably would have been even more of a smash hit now. Not only because the actors are all bigger and more famous than they already were back then. I mean, what a crazy cast to have. We'll do Arrested Development sometime, but I just kind of wanted to say about the Russos, it's like, you guys know I'm not the biggest Marvel guy, so I wanted to say sort of at the top of this thing, like, by no means does that mean that I don't respect the talent and see the talent when it's presented right in front of me. Like these dudes did something that the only other person who was able to do this before them was like George Lucas for years, and then James Cameron with Avatar. It's like, for better or for worse, they have an imprint on the film industry that is undeniable and will always be in conversation. So we'll get into Cherry and all that, but like, they're so diverse, and I feel like a lot of people forget about them outside of the Marvel of it all.
Right.
And even Community, which is every day getting more mileage as to when it was on air, unfortunately. So I think it's actually a really great way to start this, but we're not talking about their history here tonight.
Well, to bring it back to Arrested Development for 5 seconds, though, the one thing that I will say is that not just their approach to the pilot itself, but their approach to just that whole show in general is, again, a very, very underrated part to me of this whole transition into the modern age of media consumption. That, again, it's a very, very minuscule part, but just certain decisions that they made with the approach to the direction and the writing of that show. You know, when they obviously got the scripts, the idea that the show was almost written to be binge-watched before binge watching was a thing. And that's part of the reason why the show wasn't as well received, because they were setting up jokes in the earlier episodes that wouldn't be paid off until episodes later. And at the time, that was like unheard of. And they continued that with Community. And again, just they're kind of like, not foresight, but they're kind of like understanding of storytelling, as was pointed out so well on Sugith, is to me what has allowed them to be so adaptable and has allowed for their trajectory to lead them here. And I feel like that fits perfectly into the Cherry conversation of it all, because look, usually when a director or just a creator in general in Hollywood usually gets to that stance, that height, you know, where they're making, like where they've effectively made, like, all the money in the world, and they've effectively got, like, one of the biggest and best success stories to tell, it's like, well, what do you do next? You know, you've literally just made the highest grossing movie in the world for the biggest movie franchise in the world right now. Like, what do you do next? And so that was what really fascinated me, you know, and for all things considered, it's like they really did pull out all the stops and go with, like, everything. Like, they started their own film studio back in 2015 that was called Agbo, that has produced 2 movies, that has produced a couple different things, movies and TV shows. They produced 21 Bridges, which is one of the last movies starring Chadwick Boseman. They produced that movie Extraction that came out last year with Chris Hemsworth, that action movie that a lot of people were lauding at, like, the beginning of the pandemic. And
yeah, I remember that.
and they produced that show Deadly Class for Sci-Fi. That was all them. And so but Cherry is the first in a couple of movies that is like, okay, so before we were doing like kind of, you know, like easily like watchable, entertaining movies. Now we're like really getting into the nitty gritty, because besides this being, you know, another Agbo film, this is also the first film that they've directed, obviously, since Avengers Endgame. And they made it clear, because they were being interviewed by Collider's Steve Frosty Weintraub at Comic-Con, I believe in 2019, where they were discussing some of their future efforts that they were going to do with Agbo. One of those efforts that they announced was a Magic the Gathering animated show for Netflix. A couple of other really interesting shows coming out. I'm
pretty excited for that Magic the Gathering one.
And these guys know how to work a crowd up, and they know how to use their public persona from the media properties that they've made and been involved with that so many people love. They've really used that to their advantage. And I give them all the props in the world for that, because so few times in Hollywood do creators get a chance to flex as hard as they have. And what was fascinating to me was the idea that for their next movie, they were seemingly going in the total opposite direction of the big budget affair that they'd worked on for the last like 4 to 5 years. They were going with an adaptation of a book about a war veteran that is a very internal character piece that was an ode to their hometown that they grew up in, because they're Cleveland, Ohio guys. And so obviously, again, it's question mark raising, but again, I'm like, oh my God. But for me, like, I'm jumping to the bit, because for someone like me, this almost never happens. Like, you never see guys who were steeped in the blockbuster realm go to not only make an indie film, but like the indiest of all indie films, you know. And the other cool thing about their Agbo movies is that they've made very good use of all the gigantic superstars that they got to work with, specifically with their last 2 movies, Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, you know, with Holland being the third in their line of Marvel stars that they've worked with after Hemsworth and Boseman. And so the movie obviously was delayed, like everything else. It was originally supposed to come out in fall of last year, and then it ended up, I don't remember, I think that they were about to unveil a release date for the movie, and I think it was originally going to come out in the fall, and it was going to make a run for the Oscar season post, you know, pre the pandemic, and then the pandemic set in, and they ended up making the deal with Apple TV. And so the movie was released wide on Apple TV this past Friday after a couple weeks of advanced screeners and early screenings were sent out and everything. A couple of our colleagues actually got to review it. And probably what was the most surprising to me after when those initial reactions started to come out, just from our peers and I was seeing, and the initial buzz for the movie was surprisingly not that well received. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. Like, I know a lot of people, a couple people, I should say, specifically talking about the Russos, have questioned, I'll say, their directing ability now, that like, only because before they were like always like kind of working for somebody else, for lack of a better word, like, because even though they directed a lot of episodes of Arrested Development, Community, it wasn't their baby, they didn't create it, and you know,
there's a showrunner,
right? They became known as like kind of the working class directors, right? And so this is really the first thing that they've done that like they've got a stake in it. You know, they didn't write the script, but it's around an area that they grew up in that is very, very personal to them. It's a story that I bet is very, very personal to them. So now the movie's out, we've watched it, and I kind of want to get your thoughts first as far as what you thought of it first, because we didn't really text, I think, at all, aside from like a couple of initial texts that you texted me last night after you started watching the movie. I started the movie last night. I finished it today. I've got my thoughts on it, but I want to know what yours are first.
Yeah, so I guess we'll start off with initial reactions. That sounds like a great place. This was a film that had so many moments that were great and so many decisions that weren't at the same time. I felt that there were issues with pacing and with editing styles sort of clashing. It felt like at multiple times there were 2 different movies trying to appear from within the same scene, but the acting and the story kind of is so powerful that it's hard to ignore. And so you can overlook it, but to me this film is flawed, and there's only so much you can overlook for so long in a movie this lengthy. So, you know, initially I'm mixed, and I'm kind of really excited to sort of break down where I fall on every side of the fence that I kind of alluded to, because like this is a strange one for me. I'll hand it off to you here by just saying, I say everything that there is that I disliked with this movie, there's an equal amount of what I liked. And so it's going to take a conversation to get
Yeah,
through, which I guess we
absolutely.
have an hour for.
Yeah, right. It's kind of why we do this thing. Yeah. I mean, my initial reaction to it was yes. First off, yes, you're absolutely right. The length. It was definitely deliberately paced, I'll say, which is a nice way of saying it's too long. But with that being said, I don't necessarily use that as a flaw against the movie per se, only because I haven't gotten this type of movie in a while where I went in expecting not a traditional biopic, but something kind of a lot more something along the lines of a movie that I'm used to seeing. And I was not at all expecting this, which is a movie that went very, very internal and was not at all concerned with how it kind of like, making sure it hits that breakneck pace and getting to the next scene. And, we got to keep our viewers invested and everything. It was obviously, again, it's just the subject matter in and of itself didn't call for that. But I think what I got from this, and correct me, like definitely call me out if it seems like I'm getting into this, but it was definitely a situation where in the moment I may not have necessarily been enjoying what I was watching, but it was also one of those movies where every time I feel like I was getting to that point, I kept pulling myself out and being like, no, that's not the type of movie this is, kind of enjoy the story. And I feel like once I was able to get out of that mindset, I feel like that's what allowed me to really get to some of the enjoyment, because I'm not going to say that the movie was necessarily trying to be one of those movies where it asks the question of like, oh, what are the causes that end up leading to, these types of addictions and these types of problems overall, and why this is still such an epidemic, It more so was a little bit of a bottle period where, because again, this does take place in a specific period of time. It's not like trying to be anything modernist, right? If anything, the only modern elements kind of come at the end of it, right? It does the whole chapter thing, right, where it splits itself into multiple chapters, and it feels very much more so like a narrative that you would expect from like a book. It's very, very slow paced. It's not at all. What's the word that I'm trying to do? What's the word that I'm trying to look for? It's not. It doesn't like exactly have a lot of pressing action, with the exception of like the bank robbery scenes. It's not trying to really make any statements on its characters. It's one of the few movies that I think I've seen in a while that's actually, and again, Brando, don't come after me here, but just bear with me here for what I'm trying to say. Objective, in the sense of where I've watched a couple of videos like kind of trying to explain this, which is where the difference between objective and subjective filmmaking, right? Which is where objective, you usually hang the camera back, you usually let the scene play out in wide, and you're just seeing the scene play out as it is. And then there's usually the internal, where it's usually focused up on a character, and the character's inner motivation is dictating everything and kind of, for lack of a better word, telling you how to feel. And that usually can create for like some more, I'll say, problematic moments, because usually what the character's trying to get you to feel may not necessarily agree with how you're just feeling about the subject matter. And so I kind of am of the stance that while, yes, this is a very internal movie, it's also a movie that's not trying to make any statements per se on how this stuff happens. More so just, this is this one character, this is what happens to him, this is his journey, and at the end, you can choose to make whatever statement or judgment that you want. And as far as the pacing of that goes, I'll say that there were definitely points that could have been shaved down for time, but I was also a little bit grateful, only because just like, I just know this is just the type of movie that we just don't get anymore, Like, these movies just never, these types of movies just don't get made, versus it kind of reminded me of like some of those movies that like I would get in the 90s. Like, there were bits of Shawshank, and there were bits of Trainspotting in there, and there were a couple bits of like a couple other movies off the top of my head that I'm currently forgetting. But it just felt really nice, I guess, for lack of a better word, to actually get like a fully thought out character piece,
Yeah, that's totally one way to take it. We got Basic Entertainment. Matt, what's going on, brother? We have him in the chat saying this movie wasn't bad. He sees it as the Russos' first actual film post-Marvel. They're trying to find their voice when directing. I can see that.
I agree with
that. That's a fair critique.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, for me, I think there were a lot of statements being made in this film. There were anti-war sentiments. There were, there were sentiments about middle America and sort of the systems we have in place. So I wouldn't say this movie and how it affects those people, and how ultimately they have nothing to turn to. And it's, we see it all the time on the news, but do we actually care about it? I think this movie was saying a lot. So I wouldn't say that there was no statements in this film. I thought this movie was pretty unrelenting, and rightfully so with its statements. But that really wasn't what I kind of wanted to talk about tonight, because I mean, just by the nature of the character that Tom Holland's playing and his path and the life he chooses to lead, he's going to have issues. And again, what are narratives? They're watching a character overcome a series of trials, and sometimes they overcome them, sometimes they don't. And this movie has a very melancholy, sort of happy, sad ending. It serves its purpose. So I would disagree with you on that, although I do agree with a lot of what you said. But to me, to get more into the specific nature of the film, it just sort of felt like Matt kind of said. That's a good way to put it, although I want to embellish on it. This did feel like they were trying to find their voice, because some of this is like, when I said there was two films in one, what I mean was you would have this amazing sort of back and forth between him and Emily, right? And then all of a sudden we'd cut to this narration that I felt we didn't need, because we're watching these characters in this deep moment. She's leaving to Montreal. We know you're sad. We know what you've given up to be with her at this point in time. So why do we have this sort of like narration over the moment? And it felt like there was always two different views, and the text on the screen over what they were saying felt like, we're in this intense moment and now we're throwing this text up, and it's like a trailer. And so the editing didn't line up with the, nothing. It felt like there was too much creative control to each department in this film. It felt like the editor had a different vision than the writer, and then the writer had a different vision than the cinematographer. And to me personally, it felt like both of the Russo brothers had a little bit of a different vision on this one. And so there's so much greatness in here, because I think it is an amazing story at its core. I'm sure the source material it's based off is really good. I didn't know that, but it was very compelling. Like, this character and his journey and the statements they made, I thought were really great. But at the end of the day, it wasn't clear. It didn't feel concise to me. It was not that it was hard to follow, because it was, but it was messy. And so that got in the way. And here's I think what I'm really trying to say, sort of stepped on the toes of what was a great movie a little bit.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason to me why I feel like I couldn't enjoy the movie as much as I feel like I fully wanted to. Like, I don't get me wrong, I did like the movie. I did very, very much enjoy it, and I'm glad that I got it. But a lot of what you're saying is completely right. Like, it was definitely a point where there were definitely points where I'm like, okay, I feel like I'm being conflicted here as to whether this is like really, really well made, or whether they're getting a little bit too pretentious for their own good. And like some of that pretentious, like thinking that this is good because it's like, oh, this is what like these types of serious movies are supposed to do. I felt like a lot of that was kind of getting in the way. So that's what I mean when I guess I say where my confliction comes from. And as far as, because you're right with the narration is so hit or miss. There's so few directors that can actually pull it off. And this was definitely an instance where it's like, oh, this definitely feels like an instance where it's like, oh, we're trying to be, more novelistic. But there's also a point where it's like the narration just feels like it's explaining certain parts of the story that we're also seeing on screen. And I'm
Let me just say, though,
the biggest fan of that.
I thought that either would have been great if they only had one, right? If they had these actors playing every single scene out to the core, their chemistry was awesome. But then you would intercut it with this narrative that would take these actors out of the moment. And they kind of did it like almost like one of those movies where like they're frozen. He turns to the camera, nods to the camera, then they resume. And it wasn't that type of movie. But the problem is, and here's where I'm conflicted, he was a really good narrator. Like, I was compelled by him. Yeah. It's just tonally, I just felt like you couldn't have both. I don't know. What do you think about that?
No, I get where you're coming from with that. Absolutely. And there were definitely points where I'm like, what? Why is he doing that? I think what happened, what definitely helps it is that once we get into like the second half of the second act and the last act, like once we get into like the full on like, drug haze days, like the narration goes away. So that to me is like when it felt like they really, really found their footing as far as like kind of telling the story that they wanted to tell once they got into like the really, really depressing shit. But but like kind of everything and all of it coming together in a weird way. Like I felt like, weirdly enough, the parts where I feel like it's conflicting as far as what creative direction they're trying to go in are also the parts that appeal to me the most, because those are the parts that feel like, okay, this doesn't feel like anything I've seen before, you know? And as far as kind of the whole meandering, oh, it doesn't really feel like it's indecisive, oh my God, what is this crazy editing going on? That, weirdly enough, actually feels like it lends itself to the story in a weird way, only because the whole point to me of this character is the fact that because he finds himself in the situations that he finds himself in, obviously within the military and then post-military career, is because he is kind of aimless and doesn't really have a direction. So weirdly enough, I actually do think that the editing and filmmaking in general and the material lends itself to the first half. And then once we get to the last half where it's like fully embroiled, it's like, okay, this is life now. You know, this is adult life. This is what it is now. That to me is where like it really does find its footing. And then it's like the transition period from the first half to the second half is where like it almost stumbles and falls, because that to me was where I was like struggling to get through it the most, you know? Like does that make sense in any way?
No, it totally makes sense. I think I slightly disagree in the sense that, you know, I do think it was better in the second act. I think because, to me personally, some of the same problems of the first act sort of showed their head again in the third act. That was a little kind of like, oh, I thought we were really going to settle in, but it seems like we only settled in for a little while. And I think that's only really because the second act was a little more stationary than the rest of the film. You know, he was kind of all over the place in the first act, and his character was obviously all over the place in his head, deciding what he was going to do. You know, am I going to go to war because my girlfriend's going to Montreal, not realizing that it's just a tiny fight, and you know, young couples have those types of fights. So where it was messy in the beginning, because I also think this story is a lot to tackle. And so, I mean, I think the Russo brothers, I mean, how does one person direct this, let alone someone who's maybe not as experienced as these guys? I mean, this story is a lot. So I really commend them, because I do see a challenge in the material that's presented. But I do think also with people of their merit and their sort of resume, if there were people who could handle this thing and lock it in, I mean, these are the guys who did Endgame. How many different storylines and how much traveling did we do in that film? And granted, going back, I guess, to the sentiment of the show, which I didn't plan on it being that, but it might as well be at this point. Like, is this really their first test? You know, they don't have the Feige guiding them or the showrunners of the TV that they've worked on.
This is all them. This is all them as far as everything is concerned.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I hate to do that, though, because I think it is a little disingenuous towards their talent that I honestly, truly do think exists, because there were a lot of bright spots in this film. And guys, if you're just tuning in, we just kind of started off, I guess, more on the not-so-good side of things that we didn't enjoy, because this isn't a perfect movie, but it's a conflicting one, because then again, there's so much charm in the scenes that work, and it's just really... it's tough. It's one of those films that is a very tough one to talk about.
They once again prove that they know how to work with actors, though. And it shows, because there's an argument to be made. They may have gotten Tom Holland's best performance out of him. And Tom Holland, if we could just talk about him for a second, is a guy that I have had a very conflicted relationship with. Like, I thought he was the guy as far as like the, you know, as soon as he popped up in Civil War, I'm like, okay, this is the guy that's going to carry the future of the MCU past Downey when Downey eventually leaves. And his Spider-Man movies were not necessarily at all my favorites. And I started to get a little bit worried. I'm like, oh no, does he actually have the chops to match it? And then I started seeing some of his post-Endgame movies last year. Like, I thought he was really good in Devil All the Time, and I just saw Chaos Walking, and he was actually pretty good in that, all things aside with that movie. And I actually also was watching some of his earlier work, like from The Impossible and Lock It. He's always had chops. I feel like it's just a matter of just what's going to use it the best. But in this instance, like, this is the first time where you've got to actually see him as a leading man. And he carries, like, every single scene in this movie. He has to carry that naivete the naivete of like kind of like the lost, like misguided soul from the first half to the loss of innocence that happens in the second half with the military, all the way to like the becoming like the the hardcore bank robber drug addict that he becomes in the third act, and all while carrying that kind of innate sense of like loss and just trying to find one's way. And I gotta say, I really gotta give props to him, because I didn't think it was possible for really any young actor to really give that type of a performance for that type of a character study anymore. And it really, really gives me a lot of hope for his future career. And it's probably the first time ever that I've really said, okay, shit, Holland's a freaking actor. And also props to our girl for big time Rush, Ciara Bravo. What the hell? Oh man, that was awesome. Like, she was fantastic in this.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I mean, this was if anything, this was a way to just shut out any doubt against Tom Holland's acting ability, because this, it's a character study, just like you said. But I do kind of want to speak to Matt's point here. He says Tom was great, but man, I can't buy him as an older male.
Actually,
And
had a question,
I can
only because how old was he supposed to be in those later scenes?
So in those later scenes, I think he was supposed to be about 26, and we met him when he was about 21.
Okay. Well, that works then, because Holland's roughly that age in real life, so.
Yeah, that's true. He does kind of have the baby face, and you're also true with what you said, Dom.
Yeah, it's the baby face is the big thing. I had a feeling. I just wanted to break that down, because I'm like Holland's only a year older than me, and I'm 23, so.
But the reason I bring it up isn't because of Tom Holland, and Matt kind of segued me in, but whereas and it didn't bother me too much with Tom Holland, because once I heard them say, oh, he's 22, he looks 22. Okay, then that actually works now. Ciara Bravo, I had to look up her age because I thought she was one of those actresses that's just turned 18 and is playing up way older than she is, and it did not work for me. For her to be shooting up heroin, and for her to be sort of that type of person at that age, there are those types of people that exist, sort of finding themselves and living on their own at a young age. But she just looked way too young for me. I thought it was really poor on the casting side. A lot of them were super baby faced. His friend who drove the car when, the middleman between the drug dealer and Tom got shot. He had, even though he had a beard, I mean, underneath there was a baby face. His other two friends at the house kind of looked like they had sort of baby faces. I mean, I can't say that's intentional, because I've never heard of a movie that was cast that way, but
I don't know,
they might have just been the right people for the role. But I just felt like, while they are supposed to be playing 20-year-olds, something about the casting felt like maybe this is I don't know, maybe they're acting up in their age. It was weird to me, because it kind of was an issue more so than it ever has been. So that's why I'm bringing it up. Didn't hinder on their performances. Again, I think one of the driving forces of this film was the performances, specifically the chemistry between Tom and Ciara's characters. But it was a little unbelievable in that sense for me. And I had a few conversations with some people about that as well, who felt the same way. Some friends who hit me up knowing we're covering this tonight, that normally don't ever talk to me about my movie podcast, but this was enough of an issue for them to send me a text. What's your take on that?
Interesting that you bring that up, because that's been something that I've been trying to figure out for the last couple of years as well. Just kind of the whole age of obviously the average range of actors, and for these types of parts specifically, that age range has not changed, but the actors who they cast seem to be getting younger and younger with each part, and obviously that's always a big part of the casting, right? Is you obviously got to get actors that look the part, right? And obviously, since these are a bunch of 20 kids in their early to mid 20s, you want to get people that look like they're early to mid 20s. And I will definitely say that I have noticed, obviously, from watching older movies to movies now, there is a significantly little bit of a change between how actors looked at certain ages. I mean, obviously, it didn't help that for the longest time, I think the biggest amount of confusion to this was the fact that for the longest time, they cast actors that were in the late 20s to 30s to play these types of parts. And now, for the first time, it's still a very recent phenomenon that we've actually been getting the right age kids to play these types of parts. And I'm sure it is unsettling, because these are our peers, essentially. Not only are these our peers, a few of these actors are actually younger. The one guy who played his buddy Jim, actually, fun fact, that's actually, I don't know if you recognize him, that's the son of the late great James Gandolfini, Michael Gandolfini. That kid's 20 years old, 21 years old, Holland and Bravo are some of the older ones in the cast, and they're only Bravo's my age, because she's 23, she's gonna be 24 this year, and Holland's a year older than me, he's 25. So I don't know, that's kind of what I chalk it up to, because I have been having those thoughts, which is why is it that the range of the actors has stayed the same, but the actors themselves have looked younger? And this is really the only explanation that I can come up with. And I guess with that being said, I guess that's just that kind of stuff doesn't bother me. I think what annoys me more is when an actor is supposed to look older than they really are. That bothers me, because most of the time, it's because it's very easy to screw up face makeup. And most recently, obviously, with The Irishman, where those guys are supposed to be younger, but they look 80 when they're supposed to be 50, that's what really annoys me. But you have kids that are that age playing, the characters in that movie that are supposed to be that age. So so this was weirdly one of the few instances where I was fine with it.
No, that's a good point about sort of how traditionally Hollywood usually casts people to act down, and now we're sort of getting actors to act up in age. It's yeah, I guess it's going to take a little getting used to because most of the time I actually really enjoy it. You know, point in cases being Lady Bird and Sing Street. I thought that those were some really great movies where it's like, oh, cool, these kids feel like they're playing the age that they are, and you look it up and they are, and it just all kind of works.
Question
And
though,
so
real
that
quick. What do those two movies have in common that Cherry does not?
what they're just
They're
romantic
much more
teenage coming.
lighthearted. They're much more lighthearted in nature.
Yeah, that's true. And so I guess to see young people going through this does weigh on the heartstrings a little more. But yeah, no, I mean, it's just I think it's was worthy bringing up because it was something that not only myself had issues with, a few friends who I said really
Right.
never really take interest in this type of thing, decided to reach out to me about it. But that wasn't. You know, I said earlier that sometimes it felt there were two different movies within the same scene, and I stand by that because there were instances in this film where, you know, motivationally it didn't feel like it knew quite what it was doing, you know, like why did he bring his friends to the bar when she wanted to say goodbye to him, knowing that his friends were sort of a rowdier violent bunch, knowing that they don't really resolve things with words, and knowing who she is, you know, she kind of seems like the one who might always have a trick up her sleeve. It's kind of felt like a recipe for disaster. And yeah, you could say that speaks to his character, and you know, that sort of speaks to what the story's all about, but it just didn't feel that thought out. And there are plenty other scenarios too in this film where I was just thinking, I mean, but he has to grow, right? And he doesn't seem like he's growing. Kind of seems like he keeps falling for the same trap. What did you think about that?
Well, it's funny that you bring that up because just that inherent kind of storytelling device, I'll call it, is obviously inherent to these types of stories because part of addiction is the fact that no matter how many times you seem to try to want to get out, you just can't, you know? And I think that probably one of my big problems here was how they built up to the addiction. I definitely think it was more of a part of like, oh, it's a rather than a progressive build, it's like, oh, just a kind of it kind of like is explained away. It's like, oh, just a bunch of this kind of sort of thing happened, and oh, now we're addicts. That was the part where I'm like, oh God, are we actually doing this? Okay. When I've seen so many other movies do that so much more tastefully, you know?
Yeah.
But then as far as like for that particular scene, what transpired afterwards kind of almost made up for it, you know, and it kind of almost made me forget it. And like as far as them getting like deeper and deeper and deeper down like the rabbit hole, like you like there are sequences where it's like, yeah, I'm aware that that is the kind of stuff that happens like all the time, and these are kind of the traps and the pitfalls that are a part of this story. You know, it's part of the reason why I think Requiem for a Dream, despite being as traumatic as it was, worked so well, because that moved the whole idea of being a drug addict is the fact that you feel like you're stuck in this never-ending spiral, you know, that you could just this hole that you could never climb out of. And Requiem for a Dream did such a good job of just constantly making you feel like you were on that merry-go-round that you just could not get off, you know, just that swirling, never-ending spiral. And I think that when this movie worked best, it was showing all of the steps that lead to what eventually transpired with the second half, with that downward spiral. You know, I think that was where this movie succeeded. I think the parts where it didn't succeed were the little in-between moments. The parts that were like the transition period where, oh, all of a sudden his friends are there and they're being rowdy, and all of a sudden she's telling him that she's going to Montreal, you know, and like that part worked. And then I remember like it was a really weird where it felt like all of a sudden he was in the military, you know? And it just
Yeah.
it felt like there were segments that were missing from this, you know? It definitely felt like, it weirdly enough, and this was a long movie, we said, but it still felt like a movie where there's like a longer cut somewhere, you know? But obviously they couldn't make this 3 hours or longer than 3 hours, or else it would have been had to have been a mini series. And I had a feeling, no, they wanted this to be a movie.
Yeah, no, you're totally right, man. I think that added some clarification, and maybe that style might not be for me, although I believe I have liked it in other mediums. No examples are coming to mind right now, but I've had similar thoughts about this process and this sort of execution that were positive, whereas right now I'm conflicted. But you know what I will say? There was a lot of not I don't want to say not needed because it's all a creative choice, but as a critic, I felt like there were a lot of scenes that hung around for too long, and a lot of transitional moments that were kind of just there to get you from point A to point B, but didn't offer any value to the moment or to the overall story as well upon completion. like you said, he just gets in one fight with his girlfriend and signs up for the army. But we didn't really know who he was that early
Yes.
in the story to understand, okay, he might have some manic behavior. Did he have some childhood trauma? They talk about his parents a lot. We didn't see anything.
Right.
Does he
We
have
never see
maybe
his parents.
does he have maybe a diagnosis we're unaware of? Well, no one's brought up his medical records. We just know he's sort of a college kid who's struggling in college and sort of is a bit of a cynic. And to be honest with you, that wasn't enough for me to believe that one bad fight with this girl was going to send him down a path that would ultimately change the trajectory of the rest of his life. I think it's because we learn this. I know this is why I'm conflicted. Here's a great example of one of the reasons why I feel so torn, because I feel like I know this character so well, and I really appreciate the performance, and it felt very real and very believable. But to start, you kind of had to let go of, I'd say, poor planning initially to get to really what is some great stuff in this film. I don't know if that's acceptable, though. I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes a good film.
It definitely makes it problematic, is what I'll tell you, because it definitely creates for one of those instances where it's like, this could be such a great film, but, and it's always the but that kills it. And it's annoying for me personally, because even though I still like the movie, and I'm definitely one of those people where if a movie is like 9/10 good, I'm usually willing to forgive the 10th part. But what's annoying is when the 10th part, it's not just something that can easily be brushed aside. It is like valid criticisms and things that need to be addressed. And usually I'll make an exception when, again, it's like an amateur's first time effort. But these are not amateurs, and this is not their first time effort. But again, where I'm willing to give them credit is the fact of this is really the first time that they have largely been involved in something creatively where they're not just kind of directors for hire, if that makes sense. Because in all of their previous efforts, they were directors for hire. And this is the first instance where, again, they actually had a creative stake. And that's why I'm willing to give them props. Because they had this idea, they wanted to do this project, they wanted to do it the right way, or at the very least their way. And for the most part, they succeeded with that. I'll be the first person to admit, I think they largely succeeded. It's only, to me, a few missteps, and it's not enough to really drag this down and make this an overall negative experience. I think there's still too much here of promise as far as like what this holds both for their future careers and for the fact that these stories can still have a home somewhere in Hollywood, a place that they have largely vanished from, you know? Because that's part of to me, what was a lot of always the charm of Hollywood in the past was being able to give stories and voices to the types of, to these types of disenfranchised people. The idea of understanding that, well, yes, this is an epidemic. Also, just kind of, no person is entirely innocent, for lack of a better word. And like every person's choices lead to where they are, but circumstance has to be taken into account as well. And as far as for everything that this movie was going for, as far as that's concerned, I think it nailed it.
Yeah, I totally see those points. I think I'm not going to be as forgiving as you are, but I understand how you could have that point of view. I just think personally, there's always going to be that sort of standard that I'm going to hold these two directors to over others just because of what they've achieved. And honestly, I think rightfully so. I'm not one for sort of cutting someone a break just because, well, this is the first time they have full creative reign. You've been around the block, though. Your journey might have been different than others, but you've still been around the block way more than others have. But even all that sort of, industry stuff aside, just getting back to the movie itself, I understand why he became a bank robber. He was desperate, and violence is something he'd come to know. But it just, again, felt like as quickly as we got into the army was as quickly as we got desperate enough to rob banks, which was then as quickly as it was for those bank robberies to get sloppy. I mean, this movie covered a lot of ground, and I wouldn't say for the better. And it's strange because it felt really long. So I think something was wrong with I want to say, distribution of the timeline of this character's life. Because if it's based off of source material, it's, I guess, adaptation, right? And so you kind of have the roadmap in front of you, and you might take your creative liberties, of course. A lot of people do when they adapt from, text to screen, but you still kind of know where you're going. So that's why it's also a little harder for me to accept something that isn't as clear and concise as I think it should be, because I haven't looked up the history of the book. I'm just gonna assume that it might have been a popular book, or at least enough to resonate with the Russos to want to cover it. But either way, the book had to have been fleshed out, or at least in their minds, had to have been a perfect, complete story that used its time and budgeted its time well enough for them to want to make it this project right after Endgame. You know, like, this is their second film now after Endgame,
First.
right?
Their first
First?
film after Endgame.
I thought Extraction was.
No, they didn't direct Extraction. They just produced it.
They just produced. Okay, so even, yeah, for them to make this their first directorial film since Endgame, it just felt sloppy. I don't know. But I hate saying that it was still an enjoyable ride, because that goes against everything I'm trying to do as a critic. But I got to be honest, like, I'm very conflicted on this one.
It's understandable. It's definitely understandable, especially because, again, it's the first time that, like, and I feel like this happens a lot because we haven't had a movie like this in a while where it's like, no, they're because it's one of the first movies, and I'm actually kind of grateful for this. It's one of the first movies where there really was no pre-existing narrative going into this movie. It's not a blockbuster, and it's not an awards bait movie, which, again, is part of the reason why I always like seeing some of the creative efforts that come out in the beginning of the year, because that, to me, is when we get the truly, like, creative efforts that really don't have an agenda on them. Obviously, again, the pandemic withstanding and doing what it was, and doing what it did, I should say, I'm still really kind of happy that we can still get these types of movies. And so, but I understand where your conflict comes from as far as the execution of it goes. But I wanted to talk about one more point before we kind of got into final thoughts and wrap-ups, which is the pacing, it's so weird, my relationship with pacing in movies, because I feel like it's so different from a lot of people's just relationship with it in general, where I'm not necessarily going to be faulty of a movie that feels long if the story that I'm watching is good enough to justify it. You know, I'm not saying that's the case here, especially given that, again, I've said this is a flaw. This is not a perfect movie, but I mean, again, like, some of my favorite movies of all time and some of the best movies of all time have been, like, long. Like Return of the King, the extended cut, almost 4 hours long. Godfather 2, 3.5 hours long. Malcolm X, 3.5 hours long. Lawrence of Arabia, 4 hours long. You know, obviously, again, those are some of the greatest movies ever made, you know, so I don't necessarily know if those are, you know, accurate examples as far as a direct comparison, but where I feel like those do come into play is the idea of their stories are at the very least interesting enough where, even though I know I'm watching a long movie, and obviously I'm a human being and I'm going to have to take bathroom breaks and I'm going to, you know, obviously be wanting to munch on something because I can't focus for more than 3 seconds, I'm still engaged in what I'm watching. You know, and there's nothing that's directly taking me out of it. Like, to me, the sign of a bad movie is anything that takes me out of it immediately, you know? And with this, at the very least, with the problems that there was never that moment that took me out of it completely, you know? Even with the narration problems, even with the slightly longer pace, even with some of the problematic or questionable character moments that didn't necessarily fit, it was never enough to take me completely out of the movie, which is something that, again, a couple of the movies that I've already seen from this year have been that fall right in the 2-hour range and that are perfectly paced have been unable to do. You know, like Malcolm and Marie, that movie was hour and 45 minutes. That shit felt like I was there for 3 hours. You know, just how fucking boring it was. You know, like, obviously that's a joke response, but like, that's just kind of like my relationship with pacing, where I'm not necessarily going to be mad if a movie feels long if the story is good enough to justify it.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I keep bringing up pacing isn't because I don't like long movies. I review everything as its own unique entity unless it's attached to, like, a trilogy, and even then, I kind of give the film that we're talking about in the moment its own fair shake. Like, I love Return of the King as well, the extended edition. I have no issue sitting there for almost 4 hours, even if I think it is, like, over 4 hours, actually, that one. Like, I have no problems. The Irishman, love that movie. You know, that's not an issue for me. But was an issue with me in this movie was when you have a longer film and you have creative choices that aren't. So the issue for me with the pacing in this movie isn't the runtime, it's what they did with the length of the film. There were these moments that you did not need. We already established these guys hung out and did drugs and chilled and took their mind off their problems. We don't need another scene of that, you know, in the middle and then towards the end. Like, we get us something other than sort of like, oh, inciting incident, act 2. Oh, another incident. We're going to the finale. Like, it just felt like the pieces were there, but the transitions weren't. And so there was a lot lost. And time management didn't feel strong in this one. You know, I've kind of already said it, so I'm trying to find a new way to make it refreshing for our listeners here. But I think I just got to repeat myself and say that it felt like this movie just, unfortunately for me, didn't understand how to make it from a series of events to a movie. You know, it was like all the different parts were great alone, but together they didn't feel like maybe the book does. You know, they didn't feel cohesive. It didn't feel like a natural ebb and flow. It felt like we were lingering, and sometimes it felt like, whoa, hold on, we just got there and we're leaving, which to me isn't the sign of a good movie if I'm sort of questioning someone's journey who I honestly have no right to question because it's my first time seeing it. But if my mind's going there, I don't know.
Interesting. So then,
you know,
I think I've only posed this question to you, I think, once before, only because I know for a fact you've said this once before with a movie that I very vehemently did not agree with you on as far as your stance on this. But with this, I'm tempted to bring up the question, would this have worked better as like a miniseries rather than a movie?
I don't know. I don't really like I don't want to call it a game because I think it's a legitimate question. I just don't really like questioning someone's creative input in that way because I kind of think like we're not sort of speculating on what Cherry could have been. We're talking about what it was, right?
Right.
Maybe me just being a TV guy, personally, that might be something I would always go for. But I don't know. I just think for the sake of giving this a fair shake and not diluting any of my prior criticism, I just don't think that's sort of an avenue I kind of want to go down right now. You know, sorry, man. I'm not trying to like turn your question away.
Well, because again, we talked a lot about how film and TV are kind of interchangeable at this point, and a lot of questions, obviously, that get asked, particularly about new movies, and I feel that it is a very fair question to ask nowadays with all just the influx of content. Is again, some content lends itself better to long form than short form content. You know, it's not necessarily a matter of questioning just what the creators chose to go with. You know, in this case, the Russos chose to make this a movie, not a show. But this was definitely. And I haven't done this quite a lot recently, but there are a few instances where I do see this where I'm like, yeah, to me, and I did enjoy this movie a lot, but to me, this would have worked way better as a miniseries. Like 1,000 times better. I feel like if you get like maybe a solid like couple of episodes to cover that first act, maybe you get a chance to like explore some more with these characters. Maybe you get a chance to like kind of fill in some of the pieces that are missing, and maybe you can make like the transition to like the different periods of his life feel like more like engrossed and feel like they're more fleshed out than what we got, you know? So that's kind of like where I come from as far as that whole thing, only because forget like kind of the artistic involvement, the formats in and of themselves, to me, have become interchangeable. And to me, obviously, there aren't that many stories that are made now that would only work as a movie or only work as a TV show. There's a lot that could potentially work as both, but there are always sometimes those instances where no, this could usually, you know, be turned into something a little bit more long form, you know, because that's typically what, you know, that's typically what I've seen, you know, is the idea of typically when something's not necessarily like can be wrapped up in like 2 hours or less. And obviously, again, like our brains have been kind of like, we've been trained obviously by just all the amount of movies that like whenever we go into a movie theater, obviously there are exceptions to this rule, but whenever we go into a movie theater, we're expected to be there for 2 hours less, maybe a little bit more, but that's about it, you know, 2.5 hours roughly, you know? And so that's kind of where I come from with this whole like, oh, would this have worked better if it were in this other format, you know?
No, that's actually really well said. It kind of makes me agree with you because while there were moments where I was like, oh, wow, this is like making me feel very uncomfortable when they're shooting up, and I just feel so bad for them because, again, the characters were very charming, even though they're, you know, conflicted morally people. You felt for them and you were on their side, which is great when you have characters who are doing things that are not only illegal but morally questionable and you can side with them. That's the sign of good filmmaking. And, you know, also there were scenes that were just so heart-wrenching when she's, you know, in the hospital overdosing and he doesn't want to give it up because he doesn't want to get her in legal trouble, but he needs to tell her that like, I'm a medic, let me in there. And she did do heroin, but like he played it so real and I loved that. But then again, it's like, you know, I can see episode 3 we're in Iraq, episode 2 where, you know, having the real set of the relationship with Emily, and then maybe the narration works a little better because we have more time to get to know his sort of take on what he's going through, whereas they kind of force that in every now and then in this movie. And yeah, I don't know. Again, I don't really like doing that because I would hate to be questioned myself as like an artist or creator, but you raise really good points with that, and I gotta say it wasn't a bad sort of assessment.
I can think of another perfect example that's the opposite case. Lovecraft Country should have been a movie, should not have been a miniseries at all. Like I think if they had been forced to wrap that shit up, specifically with the first 2 episodes, in 2 hours or less, I think it would have been perfect. And I think it would have been absolutely perfect. If the quest is to rescue Montrose from wherever he was being held captive, that place in the second episode, and it ends with that, you're good. You're good, you know? And maybe save the rest for sequels. That's just something that I do now, because again, it's a result of the age that we're in as far as where everything goes with storytelling.
It's not a bad take, though.
What?
It's not a bad take, though.
I don't think it is. Because to me, I'm like, yeah, everything of substance I got from that show happened within the first 2 episodes. So I didn't want to have to bring that up. But it's like, I keep thinking back to it, I'm like, man, that's something that should have been so awesome that just wasn't, you know? And
right.
I don't like to dwell on what shoulda, woulda, coulda, you know? Like you
said, I just don't want to keep talking about Lovecraft Country, and it kind of comes up every few weeks, unfortunately.
It just keeps coming up, unfortunately. But yeah, so with that being said, my final thoughts on Cherry are, I'm not going to use the word misguided because I think their intentions were very noble as far as this goes. I will say problematic first major installment in the Russos' filmmaking career, I'm going to say, not just career in general, overall. This is the first film that I feel like they've actually put a big artistic lens to. It's the first film that I feel they've personally ever really had any emotional investment in, and it shows, definitely, because it allows for the good moments of this movie to really, really shine above the rest. But with that being said, there are still a lot of problematic moments, a lot of other weird moments in this movie. Like, I just thought of another moment in this movie that I feel like could have been explored more, where the one bank teller in that montage of like bank robberies was like, oh, does that make you feel like a better person, you know, after he's about to leave? And he's like, oh, did you fucking serve this country? I wish they had fleshed that out a little bit more. So that's why I'm not at all disagreeing with you on your points of problems with this movie. This was a problematic movie, and those parts in this movie did need to be addressed. And so that's why I'm giving it 4 out of 5 stars, not a 4.5, because I don't think it's problematic enough to justify a 3.5 because of those moments that you said were really freaking good. But the problems in this movie was not enough to push it to a 4.5. So for me, this is a 4 out of 5 stars.
Wow, it's a high score.
It is.
For me, I'm gonna use the word messy because you can have messes sometimes that lead to beautiful things. You know, you can like sometimes cleaning up a mess kind of sparks the brain and gets you on the right path. But sometimes if you leave a mess for too long unattended, it just gets out of control and out of hand, and you don't really know what to do with it, even though there might be something buried under there that initially intended was great. And that's kind of how I feel about this film. And it's a shame. It really is, because there's if the jury's still out in your mind on if Tom Holland's a good actor, give this movie a second watch, honestly, because I was with you. I was skeptical. Spider-Man isn't the hardest character to play. I'm not an actor, but you know, these days with CG and everything too, it just makes it easier. I mean, web slinging's never been easier. And so he really showed a different side of him than he ever has, but it wasn't enough. Unfortunately, and for as much as I liked about this film, there's more that I disliked. So, damn, I feel really weird saying this next to your high score, but I'm giving this a 2.5 out of 5. It's
I get it.
It's half of what I wanted.
Yeah. No, I completely understand. And like I said, the minute that I saw like the amount of mixed reactions from this movie, specifically from some of our peers, I'm like, oh, this is going to be a movie that it's like, I'm either going to really like this or really hate this. And I came out somewhere in between, but again, that's not always a bad thing. That's all I'm going to say to that. And I just also wanted to say that might be the best joke you've ever made as far as web slinging. It has never been easier. In more ways than one. That's a joke that I don't think Chris realizes just how funny that joke actually is that he just made. Because
I'm glad you liked it, man.
Oh, that was good. That was really good. So,
I'm just glad I didn't hate this film like everyone else
did.
Me
too. Honestly, yeah. I'm not gonna lie. I thought this was gonna be another bad education situation, and I was desperately hoping it wasn't gonna be.
Nothing's gonna be as bad as that movie.
Oh wow. Oh damn. I still. But that's another one where it's like I don't understand. Like, what did Chris miss about this movie? I don't get that. But that's last year. Again, we're not talking about that here. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we can be out here all night if that was the case.
Yeah, right. No, but thanks again for tuning in, everyone. Everyone that tuned in the chat for again the first half of the show and then tuned out for the second half like they always do. Matt for Basic Entertainment, Stranger Boy, Luke, thanks again for tuning in. As always, it's great to have you guys here. Again, we've got so much more content planned next Monday, Chris. We're finally doing it. We're finally hitting it, and apparently, unlike this movie, the reviews for this what we're covering next week are like. Actually pretty
shockingly good.
I'm like, do we actually, like, is the Snyder Cut actually going to be good now? Like, that's what I mean. Like, if this movie is actually good and watchable and actually solves for all of them, I want this movie, Chris, I'm not even kidding when I say I need for this movie to make up for all of the bad, stupid shit that DC has made me sit through for the last 5 years since this whole mess started with Batman versus Superman. If this movie could do that, I will happily look forward to everything else that DC has going forward.
I mean, even if this is good, like DC's already fired Amber Heard, they're already talking about replacing Superman. I mean, they're already just, even if this is a light in the dark for them, they still have problems.
They do.
DC has so many problems, but I'm going into this hopeful because I've been dreading covering this because it's like, I don't know, like, you got to win me over.
Here's the thing I should preface. I was never dreading covering this for the purpose of, look, at the very least, if this thing is the colossal failure that I thought it was going to be initially, then I was going to have a great time roasting the shit out of it. It was going to be a good podcast either way. But now it's like, oh shit, we might actually have a legitimately good movie to hit. So,
but like dreading it because I just really disagree with like the fan culture.
Yeah.
And like their demand on artists. So that's just always ticked me off.
The Ebert quote again on fandom?
You might have to Monday night.
I might have to. But again, we shall see because we're covering the Snyder Cut on Monday, and who knows? It might actually be good. So, but yeah, the rest of this week, this is going to be another week that you guys are not going to want to miss. We got our face-off first-time watch that we recorded yesterday that will be being released on Wednesday. That's going to be a great video. That was a great video. I cannot wait to edit that. That's going to be an awesome time. And what's it called? And then this coming Friday, again, the premiere of the next Disney Plus show, Falcon and Winter Soldier. So we're going to have a big Marvel DC weekend coming up for you guys. But as always, stay tuned because we've always got more stuff coming out. We upload stuff every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and maybe a couple of extra days soon, too, coming up. And you can find that all out by following our social medias at Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast in order to find out exactly when we have new stuff coming out. If you click the subscribe button on this video, click the bell next to it. That way you guys can get notified every time we put up new content. Click the like button. Leave a comment below. Let us know some of your thoughts on our videos. Let us know some future ideas that you want to see from us. And as always, if you want to reach out to us personally for whatever reason, whether for collaborations, whether to just shoot us some new ideas, whether to just be a cool fan and send your appreciation, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast. You can follow me personally on Facebook and Instagram at Movie Nerd Reviews. And Chris, where can they find you if they want to reach out to you about your new music that's coming out soon?
Yeah, thanks, Dom. They can find me at Christian Ivanko on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all the other apps, I suppose. At Christian Ivanko. Ivanko spelled Evanko. Christian spelled the way that you probably think it's spelled. I have music that's coming out, which is kind of why I'm telling you about this right now, because it is going to be a next chapter on that creative side of my brain. But I have some old music that I'm still really proud of. So just head over there, hit the link in the bio. I hope you like what you hear. Regardless, thanks for being there.
Absolutely. This is a great episode, dude. I really had a blast here.
Same. No, dude, we don't just do reviews, we do philosophical discussions. We do debates here. We try and offer something a little more. And I really think we did that tonight, honestly.
We do everything. To me, we have achieved my goal of wanting to provide that extra educational tool as far as getting people to think a little bit more critically about the media that they consume. So as far as that goes, again, I think that's exactly what we did here tonight. So again, if you guys haven't checked out Cherry, and you just kind of want a new and different movie, I'll say, to watch other than the typical blockbuster schlock that the media companies are force feeding you, I would say check out this movie. It might give you a little extra perspective on an area that you weren't as familiar with, and also just to support a type of movie that just doesn't get made a whole lot anymore. That's really all that I have to say to that. So with that being said, people, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.